On to our live Monday podcast. We're at noon right now. And I was thinking last week of recording a podcast to go over all of this information with folks. But then, since the government still isn't open, wasn't open then, isn't open now, it seemed like let's just do this live because things are changing on the daily or every day. Things are still the same. We never really know when things will change. We do have some update from the Senate. It sounds like there's some movement in how people are voting, at least to open up consideration of a continuing resolution. We'll see how that plays out. There's still many steps in the Senate in order to get that through, and then it would have to go back to the House, assuming there are changes made, and that was the reason it was opened up. And the Speaker indicated he wanted to give folks a day and a half to review the information before voting on. So all of this will take time, and we don't know all the particulars yet, but I do want to focus on some of the things we have seen so far with respect to federal funding, how that's impacting the disability community here in Montana and across the entire country. Really, since these are national conversations, they have national implications, but hopefully I can provide a very local focus on some of this. Specifically, how's this impacting Disability Rights Montana? Because we're not big enough that anyone would do any individualized reporting on it, perhaps. But these are things that still have big impact on the lives of people who rely on our services. So to start, this really goes back quite a ways to March of 2024. So we are in 2025 now, almost 2026. So we're a year and a half after that. That is when the last time Congress passed a budget. So to break down how these things normally work is October 1st is the beginning of a new fiscal year for the federal government every year. Regardless of whether there's a new budget, that's when the new budget is to start. And define anyone would do individualized reporting on it. You might see a CNN piece on the impact of SNAP. You might see a local Lee publication like the Independent Reporter in Helena do a piece on the impact of Medicaid cuts. You probably won't see an article about how this will impact Disability Rights Montana, or how this will impact the disability community specifically in Montana. So we're hoping to get the word out directly to people, and so you can share the word, and then hopefully it'll start spreading on social media, and it will inform you, your family, your friends on what you think about these things and how you interact with the people who are writing the budgets and implementing the laws. So, and I really appreciate the question. So that was a question that came from the comment. I am dyslexic, so I may read the question wrong. I've done that before, where I think someone's asking a particular question, and instead of reading the whole thing, I just stop. Or it takes me a little while to read it. There's also a little bit of a lag. I think I timed it last time we did a live. It was like 12 or 20 seconds. So there's no one at the button that's going to stop me from swearing or saying stuff. So I don't know what the lag's for other than just technology. But back to how the federal funding typically works. October 1st, the beginning of a new year for funding, and then they fund through September 30th the next year. And that is true every year. There have only been 4 times since that schedule has been mandated and created where the federal government, where the Congress has passed the 12 bills it needs to pass to create a budget for the year by September 1st. The last time they did that was in 1996 for the 97 fiscal year that starts in October 96. So it's pretty common to have what they call continuing resolutions, where they say, while we're continuing to negotiate this, let's just keep doing what we have been doing for the next couple of months. That's a continuing resolution. They resolve to continue spending money the way they have. And that's how the beginning of fiscal year 24 started. In October 23, they didn't have a budget. Congress didn't. So they passed continuing resolutions. Eventually, in March of 24, they passed a budget. Then when October of 24, so a year ago, that rolled around, they passed a continuing resolution because they hadn't gotten a budget yet. And then they passed another continuing resolution and another continuing resolution. And then in March, it finally rolls around. And instead of passing a new budget, they just said, let's just do another continuing resolution through the end of the year. So we are still working on the budget that was created in March of 24. So it's level funding from there. But historically, over the last decade or so, we've had pretty level funding. Here's another comment that comes in. I will read it really quick, so I'm going to pause my train of thought. I'll come right back. So so it's just a comment from another dyslexic individual, also autistic and non-binary, listening from gentrified Missoula. That's absolutely the gentrification, the generalized increase in housing costs that has made not just individual neighborhoods that have been gentrified or individual towns that have been gentrified, but the entire country really so expensive. But we know here in Montana that we have the least affordable market in the country when they take into account how high how high housing costs and how low our average incomes are. The gap is bigger than anywhere else in the country. We have phenomenally expensive housing here. Bozeman costs more than major West Coast cities. Missoula's right up there. It is incredibly hard to live in Montana, given the housing costs, but we also don't pay as well as a lot of other parts of the country. So while California housing costs are very high, their incomes are higher. Are they high enough to make it easy for people to live? No. California, Washington, Texas, New York, everyone is struggling with housing. But as I said, it's been widely reported that Montana has the biggest gap there between what people make and how much the housing costs. And HUD was cut by 10% under the president's budget. And there have been significant reductions in the grants that go out to housing civil rights enforcement. And they've even pulled back guidance that the federal government has issued itself in the past about, say, service animals and how those work in housing. And they've instructed everyone who's received money from them in the past to pull down off their websites and stop distributing in person any materials that they've developed around fair housing and they've used HUD money to do. So that's one of the examples of how the budgetary decisions have started to impact people with disabilities, where there is less help to do advocacy around, say, service animals in housing or accessible features in your apartment, or to stop discrimination when you're looking for a house either to buy or rent. We've seen a clawback of money around funding the enforcement of civil rights in those areas. We've also even taken down where we've invested money in the past as a country in developing written materials that can be helpful to individuals so they don't need an advocate outside themselves. They can themselves be the advocate. Those resources have been pulled down, not for budgetary reasons, but policy reasons. But it ends up wasting the budgetary dollars that were already invested in creating those resources in the past. So that's one example. We also have other examples I'll get to in a moment, unless I get other questions, in which case I'm willing to go wherever you all want to go. That's why this is live, because you may be seeing things that are being put out on social media or in mainstream media that I'm not, because I'm on the air right now. So feel free to drop a question or a comment in the comment section. But as I was talking about the way the funds typically come out, we've used a lot of continuing resolutions. And why is that important? One, there are no new funds in any particular areas, and that's because we simply use the policy decisions of past Congresses, past elected officials, past presidents. Again, this budget was passed back when Biden was in office. There is no new budget, and there's no budget right now being voted on. What they're voting on right now in the Senate that will go back to the House is another continuing resolution. The full budget had been debated a bit back in the summer, and then the House went out of session and everything has stopped there. So we'll have to bring the two chambers back to continue to do work on the budget once the government's reopened and Congress goes back in session. Whether that's, this year or next year, I'm not sure. The continuing resolution they've talked about is through the end of January now at this point, would be what I've seen in the media. So again, why is that important that we're using continuing resolutions? Because that means that we don't have new policy decisions in Congress and in the budgeting. There are new policy directions going on in the administration. So I wanted to run through a couple of those. Now I'm going to jump over to my notes. I will try to also keep tabs on the comments, but my earlier caveat stands. That's an area I'm weak in. So if we take that funding cycle, and that there have historically, for nearly 50 years, protection and advocacy systems like Disability Rights Montana have been operating in every state and territory. Congress has funded us to do things Congress wants done. Now we have a president who does not want several of the things that we do done. Now, any president doesn't actually set the formal policy for the government in most areas. In some, like foreign policy, they do have much greater deference, if not complete deference. But when it comes to domestic policy and spending, that is Congress's responsibility, and that is their authority. They're the ones who have authority. And they said back in the 70s, we want an entity in every state and territory that advocates for people with developmental disabilities, because there were big scandals in state-run facilities for people with developmental disabilities where they were being abused and neglected. And we can do a whole podcast just on that, both on what happened, but who were the people involved in pushing to make change happen after the world found out what was going on in there. But know that Congress decided we need protection and advocacy systems. Now, they could have said, we want Department of Justice to do more on this, or we want the HEW, the Health and Employment Agency, or what is now Department of Health and Human Services, to do something on this. We want, they could have picked a federal agency, but instead, I am still boggled by this, and I really should sit down and do some research, deep research on who came up with this idea. But it's a beautifully federalist idea. Federalism being a partnership between the state governments and the national government. And it said, hey, state governments, if you are going to receive money from the federal government, you have to, in your state, have some independent watchdog that is looking over people with disabilities. They can go anywhere there are people with disabilities to make sure they're not being abused. And if they are, they can do advocacy to try and stop that. And our focus at that time was people with developmental disabilities. Then a little later, Congress said, we also have problems with these mental health facilities all over the country. Let's create the same program. We'll just give them authority. We'll create a new program for the protection and advocacy of individuals with mental illness, PAMI. That's a mouthful. So they created that program to serve people with significant mental illness. Now we had two programs, one for people with developmental disabilities and one for people with significant mental illness. Our advocacy was done at a state or territory level, run by a board of directors made up of people with disabilities in those states and territories, and not the state government telling the independent protection advocacy system how to do its job, but rather local Montanans, in our case, telling us what we should focus on for people with developmental disabilities and people with significant mental illness. Well, then Congress said, there are these nursing homes, there's adult family homes, there's sometimes family members who abuse older people or people with physical disabilities who rely on them for supports. And then there's these employers. They were passing the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they had a Supreme Court case around housing, and then they amended the Fair Housing Act. There was lots of disability work in the 80s, and they came to realize, we also need an organization that's just going to do advocacy for all disabilities. Yes, developmental disabilities, yes, people with significant mental illness, but disabilities is a broad community that includes people who are autistic, people who have ADHD, people who have cancer, people who have physical disabilities, people who are blind, people who are low vision, people who are deaf, people who are have epilepsy, people who have depression that isn't quite qualify as significant mental illness under the federal law. People have anxiety. It's not quite significant mental illness under the law. All of those types of disabilities and hundreds more. Just Congress said, how about we just tell these protection advocacy systems, you have the authority to advocate on all disabilities in all areas of life. And it's up to your local board of directors on which legal issues are you going to focus on most? Which areas are you going to monitor? For example, late this summer, we have started doing monitoring of assisted living facilities, settings in the community that serve people with physical support needs that are not currently being met in the home. I'm not saying they couldn't, they just aren't. Perhaps they left a nursing home and now they're here, or perhaps they were at home and now they were at the assisted living facility. We were monitoring several of those. And the authority that allows us to go anywhere there is any person with a disability is very broad, especially when you put any disability in there. So that's where we came from. And each one of those has a funding stream. And I said earlier that Congress, made those policy decisions. Well, the president doesn't like that third one, has specifically requested that in its next budget that Congress not fund any work for the protection and advocacy systems for people with disabilities outside of developmental disabilities and significant mental illness, not that other category. That was protection and advocacy of individual rights of all other disabilities. That one, the administration wants to zero out in the budget. The president also wants to eliminate a couple of our smaller funding streams. We have one on voting and removing barriers to access to vote. That has been zeroed out in the president's budget, as well as one around helping people with disabilities who want to work and are working with the state vocational rehabilitation services, but having problems and not getting good services with them and needing our advocacy to help them get to work. So all of those have been proposed to be eliminated 100%. And the president has also proposed taking that second one I told you about. I told you developmental disabilities, and then number 2 was people with significant mental illness, taking that significant mental illness bucket and cutting that by 2/3 and not allowing any advocacy outside of an institutional setting. So dramatically reducing the amount of work and the focus of work that could be done for people with significant mental illness. So that's a dramatic policy change, but Congress hasn't passed a new budget, hasn't come up with what its budget's going to be for fiscal year 26 that started about 6 weeks ago. So we are, I think anytime you have an opportunity to look at what we do, both Disability Rights Montana as an individual and as an individual organization and the other protection and advocacy systems, I think when we have an opportunity to explain this is what we did last year and this is the impact we made, and we do that every year. I'm in the process of writing all my end of year reports for the year that just ended at September 30th. When we have an opportunity to explain that to Congress, they say, thank you very much. We like that. We're glad we created you, and we continue to get funding. But we haven't had that opportunity to make that pitch because we don't have a new budget being considered presently. We have, earlier in the year when there were Senate and House hearings, we did provide information about what we do, and we absolutely always provide our federal reporting at the end of the year that then the agency staff use to build their budgets, and they have always included us. However, this year, the president told the agencies he didn't want to fund several of our programs, and the agency then told us, hey, the president's budget does not, for example, that mental health side, does not include the full level funding that you would typically get, maybe even a 2% increase for the rise in cost of housing, some of the things we talked about earlier, as is often done in budgets when Congress gets to that point. But continuing resolutions don't do that. They don't have any cost of living adjustments or anything like that. But the agency said not only are you not anticipating level funding or an increase, but we're anticipating that 66% decrease. So when you submit an application, which was due in September, submit that for a third of what you used to do, and make sure you limit it to not be any work out in the community. So we did that. We put in our application, and then the staff who told us we had to do that were all fired during the government shutdown. They weren't just told, you're not getting paid during the government shutdown, but rather sent notices that they would no longer be employed. That has been temporarily put on hold by a federal court who's looking at that. But overall, there have been some significant cuts to the federal agencies that would build these budgets, that would explain to Congress from a neutral, nonpartisan perspective, but a perspective that's educated in doing this work on a daily basis. These are the important things that each of these programs do. Congress, if you want to fund them, here are some examples of things they have done in the past. You may decide you don't want to fund them. In that case, these are some of the things you will lose if you don't fund them. And that nonpartisan staff expertise has been lost, at least presently. So I'm going to jump back to the comments because I have those up now. And I said, let's see. There's a book recommendation in here that you can jump into, and one to maybe steer clear of. And then, and then there's a shout out to a report and some local reporting in Missoula about some housing problems in the Missoula area. And if I can remember when this goes out as when the recording goes out, I'll try to remember to drop in the comments, not the comment section, the chat section, but down below the notes, I'll drop a link to those reports, because there's really important work that the local tenants have been doing to advocate for themselves, organizing locally and advocating around housing in the Missoula area. And actually, there have been some organic similar movements in other areas. Bozeman has a thriving tenants union, and I've seen some other communities that are exploring the collective power of tenants. So now, if we jump back into some of the funding conversations, I want to tell you how this is impacting us. So you say, David, you are looking at not having a full budget yet, and we're already in the fiscal year. You've got the administration who doesn't want to fund several of your programs. How are you ensuring that Montana gets the as most benefit out of the protection advocacy system as possible? Well, let me walk back just a little bit before we get to the full answer to that. I mean, some of you have heard some of this either from other social media posts or you yourselves are impacted by this because you tried calling us and couldn't get through to someone, or you yourself were laid off. But we've reduced our staff by 7 employees over the last half a year, and that is half of our employees. We're down to 7 now. We used to have 14. The reason for that is all of the things I just told you about, but also the unpredictability of funding. Back in January, January seems a long time ago. You may have forgotten that the administration on its own accord just froze all federal spending. There's nothing from Congress to do that. They just decided we want to take a look at all spending. We're not spending anything until we put eyes on it. A week into the new presidency. The problem with freezing and then looking, as opposed to looking while you are continuing to operate, is all these important services that are being done have to grind to a halt immediately. And there was no notice given that, hey, next week we're going to be shutting things down. So if you need reimbursement for stuff you've already spent, get those in the next week. It was just one day the federal treasury was closed and you couldn't access money that had already been allocated. We had been allocated money, and how things work with a federal grantee is we have to do the work first and then seek reimbursement. We're told we will pay for ABCD. We have a contract with the federal government. Do these things and we'll pay you. So every month or every 2 weeks when we do payroll, we pay our staff, and then we turn around and go to the federal government and say, we just paid our staff. We'd like to get reimbursed for that. Or we just paid rent, or we just paid the heating bill or the lighting bill. And we can't do it the other way around. You can't say, well, you just gave us a contract for $100,000 to do work over the next year. Please give us $100,000 and we'll spend it as we do that. That's how many contractors work with the federal government, but grantors don't. We have to spend the money first and then get reimbursed. So we were already into January, already having staff work, and couldn't get reimbursed for the money that the federal government asked us, for the work that the federal government asked us to complete. Ultimately, that was reopened, and there were lawsuits about that. And we still didn't have a full budget anyways. We were still operating under continuing resolution. In March, the federal Congress decided we're not even going to pass a budget this year. We'll just do another continuing resolution that goes through the whole year. That's why we're still on the continuing resolution that was passed in March of 2024. So, and around that time, the president laid off half of the education department, which is significant because the education department, they pass through a lot of money to states, but one of the things they uniquely do is provide guidance to states and local schools about their obligations to serve students with disabilities and how to do that. And they also provide accountability and oversight. So that was cut in half. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there were staff that oversee our programs that were laid off at the beginning of the government shutdown. The president also laid off the entirety of the special education department at Department of Education and most of the Office of Civil Rights. These are the entities, again, that very specifically support schools in meeting the needs of students with disabilities or hold them accountable when the schools draw a line in the sand and say, we're not going to, I understand you tell us that's what we should be doing, but we're not going to do it. Then they can hold them accountable. So those resources are being dismantled. At the same time, like I said, the money that goes out to the private sector is being held up, either in that January move, but then even when Congress passed its continuing resolution in March, it and it said, okay, for the rest of the year, everyone who's supposed to be getting, whatever they got last year, they'll continue to get this year. That should have been relatively easy to continue, but the administration took about 2 months for most of the money to come, but some of it was put out in installments in smaller amounts that had never been done before. And even like, I'll give you an example of the herky-jerky motion of this is, again, in March, we were told you have all the money to do all the work you need to do, but we weren't given all the money to do the mental health work, and instead we're given it in installments. The last installment was to be for $60,000. In August, we were given a contract saying, here's your contract for the last $60,000, and you can start pulling that down. And then a week later, they said, oh, sorry, we didn't mean to do that. That was a mistake. You don't get that $60,000. And then about a month later, near the end of September, with just a little bit of time left in the fiscal year, they said, oh, no, we changed our mind again. You do get the $60,000. At the same time, we were being told, we're not really sure from the federal agencies, we're not really sure if you can use money that you get this year next year. Well, usually we get 2 years to spend our grants. So having only 1 year really, and being only told that near the end of the fiscal year, puts significant pressure, because we think we have 2 years to spend a certain amount of money, and we're almost through that first year. And then at the end of that first year, being told, well, we might actually take that all back if you don't spend it this year, which is not how the contract's written, and it's not how it's ever been done in the past. So all of that insecurity leads us to say, well, we can't take on, I can't ask staff to work and then not know if I have the money to pay them, because it won't be released from the federal government, or the government won't have a budget in order to even authorize the funds. And I can't take on a bunch of new clients and tell them, we'll help you fight this or that, and then a week later have to tell them, sorry, we actually don't have the staff to do that. So we've had to change the size of our organization in order to meet the instability that we're seeing from the federal government. So we are now out of that PAIR money. So that all other disabilities money I talked about earlier. And we are soon to be out of the money to help people who are going to work. And then after that, the next batch of money we will run out of is the voting money. So all of those buckets the president wanted to zero out anyways. The longer we are in a government shutdown and not getting new money, we are not getting funds for those programs and have to shut them down. So at this point, Disability Rights Montana has chopped its staff in half, and we've had to dramatically narrow our focus to people with developmental disabilities and people with significant mental illness. But even, as I mentioned before, even with the significant mental illness, we have been told, don't plan on getting any more than a third of what you got last year in this fiscal year. So that's a significant narrowing of work. I'm going to jump back over to the comments for a second, because I see some really good stuff there. And if it's you all going back and forth and talking, perfect. You don't need me. But if there are requests for me to talk about something, I don't want to miss those. So let me jump over here. And if I miss something, I'm sorry. You can try and drop it again, see if you can get my attention. If the PAMI grants are cut by 2/3, how will that impact DRM's ability to investigate, monitor, and advocate for people in the state? So there are two things with that. One, just the sheer number of hours we have and people we have to dedicate to it. We have a third of what we had before. So we have to be much more targeted. And that's in the raw number of hours. And I'll give an example of that in a second. But I wanted to talk about the second issue really quick, because it's one I had forgotten about. But it was pointed out to me when this cut happened. There is, in the federal statute, it was written, if our federal funding for PAMI, the Protection and Advocacy of Individuals with Mental Illness, ever drops below a certain threshold, then we have to focus our attention only at people in institutional settings. It also says that there will be no funds allocated to the Native American Protection and Advocacy System, which is located in the Southwest, in the Four Corners region of the Southwest, to serve the large nations in that region. So that doesn't impact Montana directly, but it certainly does impact America. You've got the Navajo and Hopi and Southern Ute that are huge populations of multi-jurisdictional coverage. You've got federal laws, you have state areas, you have people living on reservation lands with their whole own different set of laws and court systems. So it's a big impact in that we here in Montana would not be able to do work out in the community. So people with significant mental illness who are being abused in a group home or being denied services, they were discharged to homeless and can't find services they need, we can't serve them. We would have to focus just on Montana State Hospital, the nursing facility in Lewistown, and prisons and jails. That's plenty of work. But again, we have a third of the staff to do that work. And that means we're at less than one full-time equivalent doing that type of work. So that is pretty narrow. And then developmental disabilities is people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. These are disabilities that impact 3 major life functions before the age of 22 or so, depending on what laws you're using. So that's also a narrower form of disability. You absolutely could be blind and have a developmental disability because you also have some mobility needs or some intellectual disabilities. And so I'm not saying we wouldn't serve anyone who's blind, but only if they're blind as a part of their developmental disability or secondary to it. They also have a developmental disability. So I hope that answers. I had what's an example of a community-based mental health service. We had a kid recently who was being kicked out of school regularly throughout the day because he had emotional support needs that weren't being met by the school. So the school's remedy was send him home. Say, Johnny's having a bad day. You got to come pick him up. And that happened time and time and time again. Well, Johnny was never getting even, half a day of school. And with our advocacy, we could send an attorney there to help explain what needs to be done. We went to meetings and negotiated, and then Johnny gets to go to a full day of school where they have someone to help him with his emotional and behavioral needs when they pop up, instead of just sending him home where he's not going to learn anything and he's not getting professionals intervening to help him with his emotions and his mental health. We were able to keep him in school learning and in school accessing professionals. That's the trajectory of that kid's life is dramatically different because we were able to do work with someone with a significant mental illness in a community-based setting. Instead, we'd have to wait for that trajectory to push him out of school and towards, say, Show Dare, an inpatient, or a Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch, where it's an inpatient psychiatric center for youth. Then we could help him. It's far better to intervene earlier, keep kids home, keep them maximizing the services they can access at school and can access in community settings, and not have to be ripped out of their house, away from their friends, away from their teachers and their family, and sent across the state to an inpatient setting. So that's what we would lose if PAMI were cut by a third, not just because we have a third of the people, but because we're prohibited then from doing anything upstream before someone is institutionalized, or to correct something after someone is discharged, but discharged poorly. So another question. So about the same time as Section 504. Yeah, a lot of this stuff in March, you got January, February, and March, you have the new administration coming in and a changeover from the previous administration. So that's not just with the president. All of the leadership changes. And there was change in leadership at Health and Human Services that was not interested in defending Section 504, that's the nation's oldest civil rights law for people with disabilities. It's part of the Rehabilitation Act passed in the early 70s that said the federal government and entities that receive federal money, like us, like your local school, like your local hospital, if you receive federal money, you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. And there were several attorneys general from local states that were suing to stop some new rules that went into effect that said things like local hospitals need to have accessible scales to weigh people who are in wheelchairs. You can't just say, oh, they're in a wheelchair, we can't weigh them. And your state departments of health and human services need to follow Olmstead in order to get Medicaid money. That was something in there, and they said, no, we don't want to do that. Or a hospital can't deny you treatment because you don't meet a quality life years test. I have air quotes for those people listening on their Spotify feed or wherever you get your podcasts. And that's just a plug for, if you're watching the live feed, know that you can just sign up for an RSS. I forget what RSS stands for, but a subscription that just sends it to your favorite podcast app. And so these the quality of life years is a measure created by accountants who work for life insurance companies to consider how many good years someone has left in them, and a disabled year is not as good as a non-disabled year. So that I'm really simplifying things, but that was transported over during the pandemic times of, hey, let's use this as a means of saying who should or shouldn't get COVID treatment. If you get COVID, you need to be hospitalized, you need a ventilator, you need surgery, you need medications, you need vaccines. If something is limited, we might look at quality of life years and how many quality of life years do you have in front of you. So if you're older, if you're disabled, you will not get services when someone younger and allegedly healthier. But I think health and disability get conflated far too often. I'm very unhealthy. Very little of that has to do with disability. Those two things sort of run independent of each other in my life, anyways. So I want to. So in the early year when we transitioned over to new head of HHS, we also transitioned to an era where the federal government was not standing up for those civil rights and was willing to roll over when the states asked, some states, a collection of 17 states asked to have Section 504 ruled unconstitutional and unenforceable. Thankfully, to a mountain of support from the disability community coming together and pushing back and just keeping the pressure on and writing to our attorney general and demanding for meetings with the attorney general and holding a press conference. And we even did an art installation here. You can see on one of our earlier live feeds where we're grinding up pencils to represent the kids with disabilities whose futures will be ground up if the attorney general is successful in getting 504 ruled unconstitutional. And after all of that, earlier this summer, the attorney general with his other partners in the 16 other states filed with the court a request to amend their complaint to remove any request that 504 be found unconstitutional and unenforceable, which is a great victory. And I think something we need to be mindful of anytime you talk to me, it's going to be a downer, right? But try to think about I'm just talking about what's at stake. But nothing is written in stone yet. And even when things are written down, it's written down for the next 6 months or the next year. And then there's another budget that'll come up after that, or there's another bill that could be run after that. So we've got time to influence people, and we are the world's largest group that's targeted with oppression. And anyone could be a part of our group, and our group is a part of every other group. We are the perfect example of why everyone should work together for the collective liberation of everyone. That if any one of our groups is left behind, then our movement can't move forward. Let me let's see. I won't probably see all these. Let's see. Oh, there's a service animal thing here. I found that the laws have been a gray area in Montana, even before this administration. Montana Civil Rights Department doesn't uphold the ADA law for my case. That's probably the question that we get so often is how to address service animals and emotional support animals. And it came up this last legislative session, and I'll do a separate whole podcast just on animals because it can, one, be complicated, and two, there are a ton of people who I know are interested in it, and it could be really helpful to break some of this down. And you can whether you're flying and there are different rules than when you're at your own apartment, then there are different rules than when you go to a grocery store. So we can break all that down. And what are the effective ways to do advocacy? Because as you point out, the Human Rights Bureau is not always a great option there. Another question. Let's see, the state DD program, Lively Fern 59, I don't like the DDP program, doesn't apply to everyone with a diagnosed developmental disability. Right. That's just I made an allusion to, depends on what laws you're looking at, and are you looking at the DSM? Are you looking at sort of just a functional definition of what a developmental disability is? Or are you looking at the state access to services under the developmental disability program? They're all different. And service animals are still legal in Montana. There's a question: are they still legal in Montana? But like I said, I'll do a full breakdown. I'm not licensed to practice law in Montana, but we wouldn't be practicing law on the Zoom, and I can pull on a lawyer too, and we can talk about that. But yeah, I can absolutely expand more on that. So there's a proclamation in Missoula about it. Okay, let's see. Thank you. Okay. Oh, there. A real Montana lawyer just weighed in. Tall Golden, our legal director, was paying attention to the comments, and you can read his real answer. So let's jump back into the federal funding. We had a so you're like, well, wait, I feel like I remember a budget or something in the summertime. This HB1. Or the Big Beautiful Bill, as it was branded. Didn't that do a budget? Well, that dealt with some types of spending, and it said over the next 10 years there will be over 700 million. It's hard to fully nail down the exact number, but over 700 million taken in savings from Medicaid, and around 300 million from SNAP. You've heard a lot about SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or like when I was a kid, it was called food stamps. Money for children, people with disabilities, caretakers, people who don't make a lot of money or can't make the money because they are not in the workforce, or are working but just can't make enough money. We've got lots of people who are putting in full days at work and maybe even taking a second job, but can't get above the federal poverty line, that are getting food assistance. We talked earlier about housing and how expensive it is. And then you've got to also put food on the table. And in Montana, you have to have heat in the wintertime. And so all of these programs are being shaved down. And there's, folks who would say, well, none of this is to hurt people with disabilities. I mean, it's not going to hurt people with disabilities. It's going to hurt people who are faking it. It's going to hurt people who are stealing or committing fraud or waste, but not people who really need it. I have two problems with that. One, I've been doing a lot of work over many, many years, and the largest fraud and waste I've ever seen is not at the individual level. It's not the beneficiary. It is in the way services are reimbursed and what people are asking to be reimbursed for, not actually meeting everything that they said they would do in order to get reimbursed. And so, related to that is, let's look at what else is being done at the very same time. At the very same time, you say, we're going to cut Medicaid by, $750 million. We're going to cut that. $750 billion. It's over $700 billion. We're going to cut. But we don't want to hurt people with disabilities in the cut. At the same time, we are going to cut half of the education department. We're going to try and dismantle it as a whole. We'll get rid of the special education office completely. We'll get rid of the civil rights enforcement. We will cut the protection advocacy system's ability to do advocacy work for anyone other than people with developmental disabilities and a very small number of people with significant mental illness in institutional settings. We're going to drastically cut back the civil rights enforcement and the very advocates who would help push back if these cuts start hurting people with disabilities illegally in ways that weren't designed. We could help articulate to the state, either in an individual way or in a collective, like a class action type way, to show them, no, your way of cutting these services is actually hurting people who should otherwise be eligible. And you say, yeah, but do you really need that? Well, let's look at what happened when we rolled up the post-pandemic spending for Medicaid. When we had eligibility of Medicaid was suspended, and you could, if you were on Medicaid, you could continue on Medicaid and not get reevaluated while the pandemic was going on. And then after that emergency period was stopped, then there was a year to do all the new evaluations and kick off the people who shouldn't be on Medicaid anymore and keep the people who should be on. And Montana was one of the worst states in assessing who should and shouldn't be on. You had a huge number of people who were kicked off just for paperwork issues, yet we also had reports of people waiting online on hold, trying to ask questions, trying to submit information for 6-8 hours straight and never getting through to anyone. So we are not set up and ready to start rolling out new requirements and eligibility paperwork and all of that yet. Our state is running to do that early, even though it has a demonstrated track record that it doesn't do it well, and not like long time ago, last year. So all of this is to say, you may say the design is not to hurt people with disabilities. When you look at the other things that are being done at the same time, sure looks like it is the design. And if it's not the design, it's certainly an anticipated outcome when you've cut all of the advocacy that might be able to push back on that. So overall, there's been a great amount of insecurity and chaos when it comes to the federal funding. Normally, we'll get a continuing resolution. We can rely on, well, that'll pay until, whenever that runs out, and then we can do this. And the federal government has usually been a very good business partner, that they pay their bills when they're supposed to. And so we can do the work and get reimbursed, and we don't have to worry about that. That has been called into question a lot lately, and it makes it very difficult to plan long-term things. So we are living day to day from a federal paycheck level, but that also means our advocacy is a bit herky-jerky, and we can't plan out in methodical long-term ways. So this is a very long loop back to the question, well, if PAMI gets cut by 2/3, I talked a little bit about how we wouldn't be able to do things in the community. But even when we are able to do them in institutional settings, it really starts to constrain what kind of creativity, what sort of long-range plans we can enter into with the department and the hospital on, hey, let's look at this over the next 6 months and see how this progresses, or let's sit down and meet and talk about it and see if we can come up with a creative, collaborative solution. Those types of things are less doable when we have less stable funding. So it's just a matter of adjusting to the new reality. We're in the beginning, we're still in the first year of this presidential administration that has already formally proposed eliminating 3 of our programs and drastically cutting another one. So I don't anticipate that to change. I think I believe that was an intentional decision. I'll advocate and explain why I think it's a bad idea, but I also don't think the president cares what David Carlson thinks, and that's understandable. So, but does he care what Americans think? Absolutely. He is looking all the time at what Americans are thinking and trying to figure out how to lead from where he is. So Americans can tell him what they think, and Americans generally are more important than any one of us, right? Like me knowing what I know is of little value to a lot of people. That's why I'm out here trying to share what I do know so that you can decide what you think about it. And I'll jump over the comments here. I'm not seeing any new ones. That's great. And we are also at, how long have we been rolling? I don't want to eat up your whole day. Oh my word. Is that 12:55? Really? We've been talking for almost an hour. I think it's a good time to stop. Like I said, I will absolutely do a service animal one coming up here real soon. That I appreciate the questions. I know on Instagram and TikTok, I get a lot of people who ask about service animals or respond when we have service animal information. They use that. So I absolutely will try to do that. But as I said before, we are currently out of pair money. So I will focus on it from a psychiatric disability perspective, and perhaps from a developmental disability. There are lots of co-occurring physical disabilities. Cerebral palsy, for example, is a developmental disability that may or may not come with an intellectual disability, but is still a developmental disability. And I know many people with cerebral palsy who have service animals. So we can do some service animal stuff there, and we'll absolutely do that. So I also think it'd probably be good to do as a live so people can ask questions, but I will have Tall on retainer to come and answer real questions. Not that we will give legal advice over YouTube. We won't. So we're not going to answer, apply my individual facts and was my landlord or was the manager at the local grocery store violating the law. But we can talk about sort of where the law stands and give some examples from past cases, both national and local. And hopefully that helps you decide how that impacts you and where to go with your advocacy. But no, we're still here and we're trying to scrappily figure out what funding we do have to do the work that is needed, and we will continue to do that. None of our lawsuits that we've brought are at risk of not being able to move forward. I've set money aside to make sure we can meet the ethical and just general, legal obligations we've created in bringing big cases. We've brought 4 large class actions or systemic cases in the last year and a half. One of those has already been resolved, and we're, continuing to try to push forward on the others. And we've got some others in the works. So don't worry, we're not going away as a whole, but we are having to rescale and refocus. And I will be as transparent with you as I can. I am with my board and my staff, of course, and I want to be with you all because it is the community that we are here for. We're not here for ourselves. We are here because the people of Montana need a nonprofit law office that has the ability to go anywhere there are people with disabilities and root out abuse, neglect, and systemic rights violations. And we'll keep doing that where we can. Know that PARA's limited cap is almost out, but I think you'll be interested in what we have coming down the pike in the next couple of weeks around the cap is the one around getting people help going to work and advocating with the vocational rehabilitation department. So we've got some cool things coming up, and hopefully Congress does too in passing a budget this year, at least a continuing resolution this year that'll get us to January, the end of January. So as we roll up on a full hour, I appreciate the time you've all given, and please share the recording when it comes out if you have family or friends that you think would